Do you have a link to it?
No, because it's used for goat challenges, I can't really
Cool. Just
make it
checking.
available. But um, I'm just gonna go through and kind of explain each step. And if there's any steps that you want more of a review on, definitely stop me and ask me questions.
Okay.
Um, so what I've done so far is just installed the Python dependencies and gotten into the shell. I'm going to cd into server, and I've also set up the requests from the Postman collection in Insomnia. So I just went up here, made a new collection. Then I go back and you hit import, and then you just have to find the file and open it. And that's how that's done. Say import. Now when I go in there, they're all here. The only one we have to make any change to is this. We have to go in here and say JSON. But I already did that with this one. So that's where these are. And this will be what I use to test my requests and make sure that I'm getting the right responses. So we've got three models here: suites, vendor suites, and vendors. So it looks like it's going to be many to many between suites and vendors through vendor suites. And they're all defined without any relationships currently. So if I look in the models, we've got the suites just have the ID in the name, vendors have the ID and name, and vendor suites just have ID and price. So they're missing the columns for foreign keys that we could see right here. So I need to add the suite ID and the vendor ID. So db.foreign key, and then I'll put in the name of the table that I'm relating it to. So it'd be the suites table, matching up with this. And then the dot, and then which column in that table that I'm referring to. So the suite ID will be in the suites ID column. It's a good idea to also have nullable equals false here, but it won't necessarily be a problem whether we do that or not, probably. And we need the vendor ID. So that'll be from the vendors table and the ID column. And we'll make that nullable false. So now I can run flask db init and Flask DB migrate -m create tables, and Flask DB upgrade. And my database should be set up now. So I want to add relationships. First thing I need to add is the direct relationships. So again, looking at this, the way that they're directly related is suites having many vendor suites and vendors having many vendor suites, and sort of vice versa. So vendor suites belong to a suite and vendor suites belong to a vendor. So here I could say suite equals db.relationship. And I need to say what the name of the class is that I'm relating it to. So the suite class. And then second argument will be backpopulates. And this should be a string that would refer back to this, whatever instance this is, but it's going to be from the perspective of a suite. So a suite has many vendor suites. So vendor suites. And we'll do the same thing for vendor is db.relationship vendor, and backpopulates vendor suites. And while I'm here, I'll go ahead and just add some serialization rules to exclude suite and exclude vendor. So minus suite and minus vendor. That way, if I render a vendor suite, if I try to get the JSON for it, it won't include the two things it's got relationships with, so it won't infinitely nest. So now on both of these, they need the sort of matching relationship where suites have many vendor suites. So vendor suites equals db.relationship. And this will be vendor suite, the name of that class, and then backpopulates. And the vendor suites refer to the suite that they belong to. That matches up with this. So backpopulates suite. And I'll do the same thing in vendor, except the backpopulates will be vendor. So those are the direct relationships. But I can still relate suite to vendor through vendor suites and vendor to suite through vendor suites. So I'm going to do that with association proxy. So vendors equals association proxy. And I'm saying what I'm going to go through going through with vendor suites. And then what I would call on each vendor suite to get a vendor, which would just be vendor. And down here, suites equals association proxy. Also goes through vendor suites. And each one has a suite. That's how I get all the suites for a vendor. So I'm going to add some serialization rules. So serialize rules equals, and it always needs to be a tuple, so parentheses, and then I'm getting rid of vendor suites. So those don't show up in the JSON. And I need a comma after that, otherwise it will not recognize this as a tuple. It would just think it's a string, because it would get rid of the parentheses. So I want the parentheses and I need a comma here, so I'll keep them. So if you have an auto formatter, that's what would happen. If you didn't have an auto formatter, it wouldn't auto get rid of the parentheses, but it still wouldn't, like Python wouldn't consider this to be a tuple. It only does if you have the comma. So I need the same rule in my vendors. To prevent them from including the vendor suites in the JSON. As far as vendors and suites, I think association proxies don't get included by default, but if they do, I can always come back and get rid of those as well. But if I look here, I've got these relationships established, got these set up. And I should make it so that when you delete a vendor or a suite, that it will delete the vendor suites. So that's something I need to add to this vendor suites relationship. The cascade equals, and it's a string with all comma delete dash orphan, I believe is what it is, but just to double check it, I can say SQL Alchemy cascade delete, go to the first link, and we see that here. Seems to match what I've got. Yeah. So that should go there, and then I also want to add it to the vendor suites in my vendor class. Comma there. Cool. So I should be able to run my seed. Now that my relationships are all set up, my database structure is all good, hopefully. So Python seed.py. Looks like that worked. If I open this, let's see these suites, these vendor suites, and these vendors. So now it says to set serialization rules to limit recursion depth. So that's what I was doing when I added these. So I get rid of vendor suites from vendors, get rid of vendor suites from suites, and then in vendor suite, getting rid of both suite and vendor. So that's just kind of like the baseline default that will prevent me from recursion errors right off the bat. So the only way I could get recursion errors with JSON is if I specifically tried to include relationships, and then I can be more specific with what I want when I want to do that, and that'll also prevent rendering or recursion when I try to render the JSON. So I'm on to validations. Vendor suite, price must have a value and can't be a negative number. So that was in the vendor suite model. So here at validates price, def validate price, and that's going to take self, key, and a price. And I want to say if not price or price is less than 0, then raise a value error. Price must be set to a positive number. And otherwise, it should return price. So it should be good there. And now I'll set up my routes. So I need to get to slash vendors. So I'm going to set up my API. So I'm going to use the API class and instantiate one, pass the app in. And then I'll make a new class for vendors that will inherit from resource. And it's going to have a def get. And then outside of the class, underneath it, I'll say api.addResource vendors. And the route will be slash vendors. So in this get, I want to return make response. And then I'll have a list of all my vendors. So it'll be vendor.toDict for vendor in vendor.query.all. I spelled that wrong. There we go. And it should be a 200. So with that in place, I'm going to run Python app.py. And now I'm going to go to Insomnia and send a GET request to that URL. So GET takes 0 positional arguments, 1 was given. So that means that it passed an argument here, but I didn't set it up to take one. I forgot to just put self here. And there we go. So now we get these vendors that each have just the ID and the name. So the README, when we got our vendors, it just wanted the ID and the name. So that's perfect. Now it also wants us to get a single vendor. If we go to a particular ID, I can see that's going to want to include the vendor suites. So I may have to change something about my toDict. And if it doesn't exist, it should give me this error with a 404. I'm going to copy that. I can. Apparently not. See if it works when I copy this one. I'll do it that way. Sometimes the hotkeys don't work when you're in these like readers. I don't know. I thought I liked this README viewer, but I think I might like the default one a little better. Because this one keeps resetting my scroll position every time I come back to it. Super annoying. But I need to make a new class because this is a different type of URL that I'm trying to respond to. So class vendor by ID inherits from resource. And that's going to have a def get that takes in self. And I need to find the vendor. So I'm going to get an ID as well. That'll be part of the dynamic part of the URL. And now I can find it by doing like vendor equals db.session.get. And the name of the class that I'm looking in is vendor. And the ID is just ID that I got from here. So once I have that vendor, I can return. Well, first I want to check if I have the vendor. So if vendor return make response. And the first thing I want to return is the vendor.toDict. And then the status code will be 200. And then if there isn't a vendor, then return make response. Didn't want all that stuff. So just this, I copied from the README. But then that'll be a 404 code. That looks all right. And we've got this still running, so I'm gonna hop over here and go to this, except I won't be able to make the request yet because all I did was make this class. I need to add it to the API, so API.add resource, vendor by ID, and then the string will be /vendors/ open caret int : ID close caret. matching what we have here. It's going to try to find the first vendor. Looks like it works, but it doesn't give me all the JSON I wanted. Because I wanted to include the ID, the name, and the vendor suites. And then within vendor suites, it should include ID, price, suite, vendor ID, and suite ID. So I need to include vendor suites first of all. So when I'm doing toDict on the vendor, I'll say rules equals, and then that should be a tuple. So parentheses, and then I'm going to add vendor suites. Put a comma after that. So it should include vendor suites. Now I'll try again, and we see it includes vendor suites. They have the ID, price, suite ID, and vendor ID. So it's still missing the suite nested within the vendor suites. So I want to say, not only should I include the vendor suites, but I should include the vendor suites dot suite as well. Now I hit send and I see I've got the vendor suites and I have the suite within the vendor suites. So I'll pause here. Are there any questions about how I set up my routes or how I set up any of my serialized rules? Okay, that's good. I'll keep going then to whatever comes after this. So the slash suites should get all the suites. They should only include ID and name, which I believe is already going to be what they look like, since I already have the minus vendor suites here. So I'm just going to copy this whole thing for the vendors and just do it again, but change it to suites because it's pretty much the same. Where I get all of them. And then I call toDict on each one, put them in this list, and I return this list with the 200. And then this API.add resource just needs to add suites using the /suites URL. Now I can test that here. My server turned off because I had some kind of indentation error. So I'll start that back up. And perfect. Just including the ID and name of every suite. So now somehow it keeps resetting my scrolling. It's not just scrolling forever. Okay, cool. Now I need something to get one single suite. It looks like it also just includes the ID and the name. So I don't need to do any kind of special serialized rules or anything. Just going to be the same. So in my app.py, make a new class for suite by ID, inheriting from resource, def get itself and ID, and we'll find the suite. So suite equals db.session.get, and I'm looking in the suite class for the one that has this ID. And then if I found the suite, then I can return make response suite.toDict with a 400 or with a 200. And if I didn't find a suite, then I can return some JSON with error suite not found. And after that JSON, there should be a 404. And now I need to add this to my API. So api.addResource, suite by ID, /suites /open caret int :ID close caret. And now I'll hop over here and test that. And that looks perfect. So now I need something to let me post to vendor suites. And the body of the request will look like this. It includes the price, vendor ID, and suite ID. So if it does create one successfully, meaning the price was a positive number, then I'll send back this kind of response. It's going to have the ID, the price, the actual suite, the suite ID, the actual vendor, and the vendor ID. And then if it's not created successfully, it should come back with this. So new class will be vendor suites, inheriting from resource. It'll have a post. And first thing I need to do is get the JSON from the request. So vendor suite JSON equals request dot get JSON. And then for key in vendor suite JSON, I'll check if I'll make a new vendor suite, I guess, first. So vendor suite equals vendor suite. We instantiated a new one, and I'll check if has attribute vendor suite key. And I think that's right. Yeah. Then I want to set the attribute. So set attribute vendor suite key, and then I need the value. So this will be vendor suite JSON dot get key. And I need to make sure I'm inheriting, or that I'm importing vendor suite. Use that. There we go. So while I'm setting those values, that's where you can run into validation errors. So we need to say try. And then here we'll say accept value error. And that's when I want to return make response. That'll be a 4, I don't know if it's going to want 400 or 422. Either one would be okay. I'll say 422. And then in here, errors be a list that then just has a string in it that says validation errors. But if this was successful, then all the keys should have been set on it. So we can go ahead and add it to db.session.add vendor suite and db.session.commit, and then return make response vendor suite.toDict 201 for created. And last step, there'll still be one more thing I have to do with serialization probably, but the last step to at least get something working would be API.addResource vendor suites. And second argument will be the actual string, so slash vendor suites, the URL I want to use. So now I can send the request. Looks like it did create one, came back with an ID. So it just made a new vendor suite. It didn't include the vendor or the suite in here. So this toDict, I can say rules equals, and I want to include the vendor and the suite. And I'll try again. And now I included the vendor and the suite. So that looks like what I wanted. Now I need to try it with a negative number price and make sure that I get what I wanted, which looks right. So now I need a delete for vendor suites with a particular ID. The response it wants is an empty object. So sometimes you just make it fully empty with an empty string, but in this case, it wants us to do an empty object. And then if that didn't exist, then it should respond with this. So one more class here. Vendor suite. By ID. Inherits from resource. And that's going to have a def delete. They get self and an ID. And we're going to look the vendor suite up. So vendor suite equals db.session.get vendor suite using the ID. And then if there was a vendor suite, db.session.delete vendor suite. and return make response. It's empty object with, I think, a 204. And then else, if there was no vendor suite, I want it to basically be like this. But it should say vendor suite not found. And now I can go there and try to delete the first one. Didn't work, but this isn't the same type of not found error. This is a different kind because we're seeing all this text here. So this tells me the route doesn't even exist. It's because I made the class, but I still forgot that extra thing of API.addResource. Vendor suite by ID. And that was slash vendor suites slash open caret int colon ID close caret. And now no body returned for response. So I don't see the actual empty object, but I think it still might work. But we'll see. We'll run the tests and see if it has a problem. But if I try to delete again, interesting. I keep getting 204, no content. I'm never getting the 404. That's because I'm not actually deleting it just by doing this. I need to do db.session.commit after that. Now it worked the first time after fixing that. And then I try again, and any subsequent time, it's going to give me the error vendor suite not found. So all the testing on Insomnia seems good. I'll try with PyTest. And it's complaining about at least one, looks like a few things. So it wants a 400 status code if that fails. So instead of a 422, 400. I'll do a -x so we get just the failure. So this time it doesn't like my validation. Not totally clear to me. What it doesn't like here. It seems like I'm enforcing that, but maybe no, I think I know what's wrong here. So I made a mistake with the price validation where I said if not price. Problem is if you set it actually to 0, then not price is actually true because 0 is falsy. So that would cause us to throw a value error, even though we shouldn't have. So I should actually say if price is not none, or price is less than 0, then raise the value error. That way, if price was 0, then it still doesn't meet any of this criteria, which means I shouldn't throw the error.
Could you also do something like, if price return, or, if price return price, else raise value?
Don't
Like
think
switch
so.
it?
Like, well, I could switch it kind of, but it would still have to be, so I'd have to do basically,
All right, because then
if-
you'd still have the problem with 0 anyway, never mind.
yeah, so I'd have to say if price,
I know it just wouldn't work.
and, or, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it'd just be something extra complicated for no reason.
Yeah, I think it would actually be a little harder to like reverse it. It's possible, but sort of make sure it's not none, and then that it's greater than 0 here. If we're still like, this isn't really the perfect validation, like I would probably want to, even rather than price is not none, I'd probably just want to say like if type of price is number, or is not num, is not, and I guess that would be like integer in this case, actually. So if the type of price is not an int, or the price is less than 0, but is instance would be better. So we'd say if is instance price int, but we'd say not, because if it's not an instance of a int, then I want to raise the value error. But it depends. If prices could have decimals, then we'd need to make that a float or something. But that would be a little better, because now it guarantees not only must it be in existence and greater than 0, is must actually be a number and greater than 0. Because we'd hit like an uncaught exception probably if someone tried to set it to like false. Because then you try to compare false to 0 and you can't really, so kind of fail inside here. But it wouldn't throw the right value error, it would do some other weird issue, potentially. So it's not wanting us to have to like think about that or care about that though. So mainly we just need to make sure that we're making sure it is set, so it's not none. Except in this case, really we should say that if price is none. I think maybe that's what I was mixed up on, because I want to raise the value error if price was actually none, or if it's less than 0. Maybe the reverse wouldn't be too bad. I could say like if price is not none and price is greater than or equal to 0, return price, else raise value error. So either way. either make sure that it's not none, so it is something, and it's greater than or equal to 0, and then it's all good if both of those are true, and raise the value error otherwise. Or you can say if it is none or it's less than 0, then raise the value error, and then return price otherwise.
That's what the error.
I usually like to check what the conditions should be if there should be an error thrown, but either way is okay.
Didn't the error actually give you the one you just did, the greater than or equal to? In the actual requires price greater or equal to 0.
Yeah. But that's just it doesn't check that I literally did that. It just checks like logically, basically. So like
Oh, okay.
If I'm checking if my price is less than 0, then throw the exception. That's the same as checking if it's greater than or equal to 0, don't throw the exception, basically. There we go. Now it's passing them all. So any questions, anything anybody wants me to look at again?
Could you walk through the post for me real quick one time? That's probably the one I have most trouble with, I think.
So first I get the JSON just by calling request.getJSON. Then I'm going to create the new instance and just instantiate one that's blank. And then I want to try to set all the properties onto it. And I want it to potentially throw exceptions if I set any that are not following validation rules and stuff. So I'm going to start my try block. So inside the try block, I'm iterating through every key in my JSON. And for each one, I'm checking if my vendor suite actually has that attribute in the first place. And if it does, then I'll try and set the attribute. So then I pass in the vendor suite and then the name of the attribute, and then this vendor suite JSON dot get goes and gets the actual value using that key. That was from the original JSON that I got. And once I've looped through and set all those, then I can go ahead and add it to my session and commit. And then I can just respond with the vendor suite.toDict. It wanted the extra things for vendor and suite, so I put those rules in. And then it's a 201. So this is just a shortcut for doing something like vendor suite dot price equals vendor suite JSON dot get price vendor suite dot vendor ID equals vendor suite JSON dot get vendor ID, and vendor suite dot suite ID equals vendor suite JSON dot get suite ID, which could also be done like this. If I put this in my try block and I set the price inside there. So price equals this. Vendor ID equals this. And suite ID equals this. And I don't need any of that. So that'd be another way to do it. The problem I have with that is the just extra hard coding I have to do for every attribute is annoying. But there's nothing really wrong with doing it this way. There's actually a little bit of a hidden advantage doing it this way, which is if someone just didn't include any price in the JSON whatsoever, the way that I had it originally probably would not try to set the price attribute because it's going through what was given in the JSON. So if they just didn't include a price at all, then as I go through looping through every key in the JSON, I'm never going to try to set the price, which means I'm never going to hit this validation, which means I never raise a value error, which means I accidentally add it and commit it and respond with it instead of actually checking that validation. So really the better way to do this would be like for key in, and then instead of vendor suite JSON, I may hard code the keys here and say, here's the like required keys. Would be like vendor ID, suite ID, price. And these would each be their own. So then I go through each one of these, and then for each one, I guess I wouldn't need to then check if it has the attribute. I can just set the attribute on the vendor suite using whatever key that was, and then still do the vendor suite JSON.get and find it from the key. So this may be slightly better in some circumstances to do it this way. It doesn't really matter though, like any of these ways would be okay for the purposes of this. Yep. Any other questions? Okay, I'll go ahead and stop it here then. And give you the rest of the time to